Welcome to all the queer people who clicked on this video because they saw the title and went, "Oh yeah, I remember watching or hearing about that show. What did happen to Q-Force?" And also welcome to all the straight people who presumably just click on things they don't know about but would like to learn. And that's exactly what we're going to do today with the show Q-Force. Q-Force, Q-Force, Q-Force. What a show, and that's right, I'm not talking about the alternative title for Ratchet & Clank Full Frontal Assault, or G-Force, another game in which you play a bunch of super smart guinea pigs.
That was too close.
There's no real way to get us back on track after that tangent, but I have to at least try. So we're in fact discussing the queer-centric animated spy comedy series that definitively placed itself into the adult comedy section rather than the kids or teen animated queer show section that quite a few other shows have already kinda done. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about this was because of the fact that it was very maligned on release. It was heavily criticised and ultimately canned after one season, especially because it was a Netflix show, and you know the survival rate for LGBT shows on that network. Bad. Really, really bad. But there is some value here to talking about Q-Force, because while I can definitely point to many other LGBT shows, and when I say LGBT shows, I'm talking about ones that don't just have a queer person off to the side, but are ensemble casts of predominantly queer people with our narratives and our voices put front and centre. I could think of quite a few, like Heartstopper, Pose, Interview with a Vampire, Transparent, Owl House, Dragon Prince, Kipo, She-Ra, Dead End. But with all of those, I noticed they fall into two different camps. They're either kids animated shows, or they're not animated shows at all. There aren't really many LGBT series which try to go into the same box as stuff like Rick and Morty, Archer, American Dad, Family Guy, BoJack Horseman, Paradise PD, and yes, I am sure that you can bring up gay or trans or whatever identity group you want people from all of those shows, and my point here isn't that we don't exist in those shows, but that it isn't built from the ground up to be something featuring just us and written by us and starring us with our stories. They're more generalised than that. But Q-Force did try. It did attempt to break into that world of adult animated comedy with an explicit LGBT directing, writing, casting and so forth, and yet it failed disastrously. So disastrously that it got basically wiped from the media landscape. Nobody is going to make stuff in the future that references it as an inspiration, and I would like to know why. I want to understand that. So, with that intro done, let me just give you a speed run of what we're talking about here. 1. How well did Q-Force engage with LGBT identities? Was it well put together? Did it present multiple expressions of different groups? Did it align with experiences that speak to queer people? 2. How well did it translate all of that into comedy and developing a spy narrative? Because that's what it billed itself as, and so, is it funny and interesting? Does it show people that you can do trans jokes without falling back on "I identify as an attack helicopter" or whatever tired shit right-wing comedians are still doing? And 3, what went wrong and why did it vanish? How did it end up failing and what can be taken away from that? Anyways, with all that said, let's hurry along and get into answering that first question before people think I'm just stalling. I'm not, I'm just an honest rambler who can't keep a lid on anything that I'm thinking of at the time.
None of you asked, but I'm sure as hell gonna tell.
So yeah, our beginning question to answer requires a bit of discussion about what goes on in Q-Force. Though thankfully we will not be discussing the entirety of the show like some wacky 4-hour deep dive. Within Q-Force there are numerous queer people, which makes a lot of sense considering the fact that it was literally what it styled itself as. We have characters like Steve Merriweather, our gay lead whose gayness tanking their career in the spy agency is what gives the narrative initial motivation and leads to much of the developing conflict. Steve being a somewhat still kind of standard effeminate gay, but shoved into being a top tier agent who is work obsessed.
10 years ago, you told me I'd be running this agency by now, but now I can't even get a case?
Twink, who is the team's disguise expert, an expert because they are a drag queen who can perfectly dress himself up as anyone, and Twink is very much the hardcore gay theatre kid stereotype that you might have seen a hell of a fucking lot on basically every drag TV show that ever existed. Reading and slaying and stanning and having basically no personality or funny thing about him. I'm sorry, Twink is one of the characters who really makes this show hard to watch because they get an unbelievable amount of one-liners compared to everyone else, and yet every single time without fail, they manage to squander that comedy wealth by just using basic references to gay stuff or some silly effeminate shit to emphasize how he is a drag queen.
It was my 11 o'clock show and I was doing something groundbreaking with my hair. Red!
There's also Deb, the butch lesbian who is the team's mechanic and has a wife and is effectively the most mature and centered person in the group, who acts like a mother to the rest of them and keeps them on track to actually getting stuff done. Also, yeah, Deb does kind of just fall 100% into the most obvious interpretation of a butch lesbian, something that becomes quickly apparent during episode 2 when the rest of the gang collides with her big biannual lesbian get-together and we see them engaging in a lesbian culture defined by coleslaw, bees, cars, women's sports, zoning laws, and trauma dogs.
Construction, winter sports, bee sustainability.
Wait, that sounds like a job for the lesbians.
Yeah, quite the selection of elements. Our final queer person in the group is Stat, a transgender goth hacker lady who is constantly talking about wanting to do crimes and how much she hates people and drinks Mountain Dew and falls in love with a robot lady who then kills herself to help a mission one time, and Stat is actually barely relevant to much queer stuff. I know, that seems crazy. Every other character really does emphasize their label quite heavily and consistently, but Stat barely engages with trans identity during this show, and being trans or trans people existing has no real involvement in the plot of any episode. Everyone else in the group gets explorations of their queer identity, they get time spent on it, but Stat and trans people never get given a single fucking one. Something which actually did really surprise me more and more as time went by. Like, I don't know, is this just another case of a gay creator and gay executive producers just not doing trans stuff because of reasons? From what I can find, there is not really a great justification for why Stat and trans identity gets shafted. The creator, Gabe Liedman, talks extensively about how he based Stat on a trans goth writer friend of his who was involved in the writing staff for this show, so it just seems like a bunch of queer people managed to completely fail to incorporate trans people into their TV show about the LGBTQ. Great to know that it's not just cis straight people who fuck it up. All of us can do it too, apparently.
Stat, glad you're here. A fellow workaholic. Want to work a case?
Not really.
And before I move on to discussing more behind the scenes stuff, let me quickly just finish out the main roster by mentioning Director Dirk, who is the hardcore straight bigot that runs the spy agency and has effectively clamped down on any minority succeeding for decades, and that isn't just a patriarchy, glass/cotton ceiling kind of statement. An entire narrative at the mid-end of the season is about how the AIA has literally used brainwashing to try and initially conversion therapy queer agents before giving up and just wiping their memories of being spies at all. All because the people in charge hate gay people and had the budget and freedom to engage in what I can only describe as a horrifying violation of humanity, which the show does not really give its due deference because it's too busy being a pretty average comedy.
Agency has the ability to mess with our minds.
If they can mess with our minds, what else can they mess with? Our asses?
That's something that we need to relegate more to our discussion of the second question about how well they handled being a spy comedy in this show. There's also Rick Buck, the straight agent assigned to watch over the Q-Force as they go on their missions, and who over time becomes an ally despite them having all their bigotries about the team that don't really massively change that much over the course of the season, but at least he sides with the gays. And finally, Deputy Director V, the female mentor of Steve, who initially pushed for him to work within the system and try to change the AIA by working in its rules, despite the fact that doing so led to her getting relegated to desk duty with no real power, and Steve getting banished for 10 years to a dead-end assignment with no real spy action.
I have the perfect assignment for you.
Before a bunch of events that are part of the wider Q-Force story see her go fully over to the side that wants to dismantle the AIA and rebuild it from scratch. Now that all the characters that we should care about have been mentioned, well, at the very least the ones that begin the show, more will probably come up during the narrative discussion, I want to mention the actors behind the names. Because Q-Force does have every character played by an actor which actually matches their identity, something which I have pushed for in the past as being useful for giving people in those groups some ability to express themselves in ways that other actors might not know about or be able to engage with. We have Sean Hayes from Will and Grace playing Steve, Matt Rogers playing Twink, Wanda Sykes playing Deb, and Patty Harrison playing Stat. Now, there ain't much more to say other than the fact that this show has made me realise that this is not a guaranteed way of getting successful representation. I mean, it's good just because it gives queer people from the community a foot in the door for an industry that can be somewhat tricky to get into. Well, I mean, I'm saying that mostly for the trans person involved, I guess. Gay people have had quite the Hollywood run for a while now, but ultimately, this kind of representation and alignment between actor and character cannot ensure quality. Though, I would argue that if we're comparing a trash show to trash show, at least Q-Force has more actual connecting queer stuff in it than those shows that are entirely made, written, acted and directed by the straights. Sure, the queerness might not hold up to better written shows like Heartstopper or Sense8, but Q-Force still stands above other shows in the same area that it really belongs to. This truly is something more for discussion when answering question 3 about what went wrong with Q-Force, and will make a bit more sense by that point, so let's relegate the rest of this discussion to that point, eh? Anyway, now that we've done the characters, it's time to look through the storylines and see what queer stuff came up, and what we can say about that. Is there quality to the queerness that appears? Is it covering topics and ideas that are fresh or provide new perspectives? Is the queer narratives distinct enough from the comedy and spy elements that it isn't overshadowed and better relegated to that section of this video? Well, those are actually all really great questions, and let me just quickly answer those now. Kinda, not really, and sometimes. For a bit more detail, I think Q-Force actually starts off quite strong with what it is doing. We get introduced to the team and their talents/capabilities first and foremost, their queerness being incorporated into that in a way that complements the elements rather than supersedes them. Which is great because it reiterates that idea that queer people can be more than just queer. They have lives, identity outside of that, interests that are just as important to who they are as a person.
I just want to enjoy our barbecue with my wife, my friends, and my 16 trauma dog.
And alongside that, Q-Force does very well at presenting the people in the team having queer lives as just a norm. Twink hooks up with guys and hangs out with drag queens casually. Steve dates men in the same way that a straight main character would date women. And Deb has her wife exist as something that does just exist and comes up naturally. Stat doesn't really play into their transness much at all, which can be good, because trans identity should not be something that needs to be talked about all the time, but when it comes to representation, it is kinda necessary to do. Like, sure, in real life it's great for trans people to not have to talk about it, but if you just don't talk about it in a TV show, then it functionally might as well not exist. The queerness of the characters is also used to solve problems. Their experiences are played into as a strength that they can draw from to better understand issues or find answers that others might not be able to do. And in episode 3, we do see them present a gay man, the main gay miner of the episode, who Steve must seduce for spy purposes. Well, we see this gay man act in a more traditionally masculine way that does not negate his gayness, even if the characters involved do seem to be somewhat surprised that this man is gay.
Ennis, gay. Well, who's next? Olympic skier Gus Kenworthy? Fuck you.
How they discover that, though, is by identifying queer minutiae and objects around his room, all of which is effectively saying that you can tell a queer person based on certain stereotypes that will always shine through. And that is where we kinda hit the rub of Q-Force's failings in the queer representation department. See, while in episode 2 we do get to see a visual variety of lesbian characters at Deb's barbecue event, ultimately, all of them are shown to effectively share the same interests and attitudes and affects, which kinda end up making lesbians come across as this monolithic block. There is effectively one kind of lesbian that Q-Force engages with, and that's it. No more than that. We already mentioned how completely lackluster the trans representation in this show is, even worse than the lesbian one, because we barely even get a chance to be stereotyped, just having one character supposedly assigned to us who doesn't really bother discussing the trans community or their connection to it, which you could say is great because it falls in line with Stat's characterization as an antisocial criminal hacker who generally seems to dislike people and even once talks about their connection to the queer communities in California as distant, but in that case, I would have liked to have more than one trans person in the show so we could get some more trans stuff in there for the trans people.
Wow, do you bring your friends here?
Nope. You were the first.
I'm not asking for much, maybe just that we get the same pretty meh representation as the lesbian community in this show. Because the trans thing is even more rough, as we don't even get the nice normalization style aspects that I was being congratulatory to Q-Force about earlier. We don't get Stat mentioning some things about being trans casually, and in a way that suggests it's just something that you can openly, mildly discuss without any big deal coming out of it. There isn't anything like that, which really suggests that Stat is more than just a lesbian. Most of her queer scenes end up kind of just being stuff for that lesbian group again. And this lack of trans stuff even extends to very much minor things, such as during episode 4 when Harry Potter is mentioned in a queer-related joke, and there is nothing brought up at all of the complicated relationship between that franchise and trans people at that point. Something which, even if you think the trans community should just get over it and that J.K. Rowling is speaking the truth, even if that is your opinion, a queer show featuring a trans character should at least have some comment or something to say on Harry Potter being brought up as something of a queer identity.
Christmas! The holiday from my favorite movie, Harry Potter!
And while I would say that gay men get the most favourability within Q-Force, leaps and bounds beyond everyone else in regards to how much time is spent on that community and exploring elements of that community and letting them dominate the comedic stylings of the show, even with that hierarchical position they've been given in representation, we sort of see the same issue a little bit. During the gay episode, episode 5, the one that really explores gay characters heavily after the more generalized introductory arc, each of the gay groups we get introduced to are all sort of shown to be different in appearance and act, but sharing the same interests and the same perspectives on things. It's that goddamn miner again from episode 3, where despite the fact that he seems more masculine, in his bedroom are all the things that let you know actually nah, this guy's gay. Which is another time where Q-Force turns a queer group into a monolith, all of whom are basically the same when you get down to it and know all the same shit, and that is just straight up not true, as can be proven in one single sentence. I, a queer fucking person, had no fucking clue what the hell Twink was talking about in half the jokes they goddamn dropped.
TikTok lip sync? Way ahead of you. I already turned my paperwork into a freakum dress.
He's clearly naming famous people, or scenarios, or movies, or whatever that appeal to theatre gay kids, the people who probably make up the majority of the cast and writers, and I just don't know if what he is saying is funny or not, because I don't know what the fuck he's talking about. And it's that level of esoteric, that way in which this show is made by gay theatre kids, for gay theatre kids, that I think does ultimately hurt the variety of queer identity that it could have engaged with, that does reduce its capabilities to be more. Something which we will lock in further when we get round to that final question of working out what actually went wrong with Q-Force. For now, I leave you with one final problem that I found, and it's not so much related to the queer question, but kinda is. See, a plot point during episode 7, an episode wherein Steve is off doing family stuff with his boyfriend Benji and dealing with fallout from V, the rest of the gang is pranking the straight bigoted dude Rick Buck by catfishing him as his kinda girlfriend, the princess of insert fake European country name here.
Genorvia in the heart of the Transylvanian Alps.
Yes, little country. Absolutely host the big girl.
During the course of this catfishing though, it gets very physical when they attempt to stand him up, and then Twink decides to actually just dress up as the princess and string Buck along even more. Something which carries on until we discover more stuff about Buck, which makes him sympathetic and sad. Backstory stuff that paints the way he acts in a different light as just an orphan who got abandoned by every family he was adopted by, desperately seeking the approval of the shitty, homophobic, sexist director of the AIA as a father. All of which leads to Twink, still as the princess, to kiss Buck and then leave.
We've gone too far. Abort mission!
Oh, Buck.
Now, I don't want to be that person here, but what Twink did here is sexual assault. You pretended to be someone else and used that to trick a man into kissing you when he thought he was kissing his partner. And thank fucking God it didn't go further than that, despite Twink's constant insistence that he wants to fuck Buck one day. This is a really creepy thing to do. And the way that none of the queers address that part at all as a problem, the way that they play the whole thing off as a prank that they feel bad for because it made Buck sad, and they buy back his favour by giving him the jet to go and actually see the princess, well, all of that kind of paints them in a really bad light, and it really paints the writers in a bad light too. I don't know if this is just a thing in writing circles, because the same thing sort of happened with the latest season of The Boys, where Eric Kripke came out and weirdly defended the scene involving a male character being sexually assaulted as designed to be funny and just playing into the whole joke of Huey. And here we see this straight cis man also get sexually assaulted as a joke. We need to better acknowledge that any group of people can deal with that shit, and that it can have serious ramifications and isn't just something for comedic purposes. We shouldn't just be saying, well, it's happening to a straight man, therefore it's actually funny, because we don't want the consequences of normalizing that attitude. I'm with you here, straight cis men. It wasn't funny in The Boys, and it certainly isn't funny here. You do, in fact, deserve better when it comes to this serious issue that has ramifications on your community. See? I can connect with you guys on that struggle, and if you can empathise with trans people and our representation issues too, then hey, maybe the world can be a better place, filled with understanding and connections between people. I could hope anyways. With that said, I now want to move to answering the second question for Q-Force. Specifically, did it succeed in being a comedy series and an animated spy series? did it manage to combine queerness into those aspects in a way that showcased how having that identity be part of it doesn't diminish the quality of those narratives.
We won't be on the sidelines forever. We're too good.
Something's gotta change, or you're gonna lose the rest of us real soon.
And to do this, we kinda need to examine the arcs from the show, which we will do efficiently and concisely for once in my goddamn fucking career. So there are 3 identifiable arcs within the show, each one reflecting the relation between the Q-Force and the rest of the AIA. The first is trying to figure out who is stealing uranium and to stop the uranium thievery. The Q-Force getting the job because they went rogue and then got the support of the big female boss ally V. It ultimately been used to show how little respect these minorities get within the organisation. And also, the terrorists are all Kazakhs, and we are talking visibly designed to align with the most generic version of a Kazaki terrorist that I assume an American creator or audience would connect with, and it all comes across a little bit racist.
I know, oh shit! Table of suspicious Kazakhs, 12 o'clock. Let's go!
I know many of these spy movies and shows all kind of adopt a very anti-other countries kind of vibe, but it is odd that Q-Force kinda does that xenophobia and doesn't make it clear that this is supposed to be a satire or parody of that element. It just sorta has it. Archer did do some effort to try and comment on those elements when it brought them up, and I think that Q-Force really badly had to ensure that it at least did as well as Archer in this area for it to succeed. The second arc revolves around an in-America conspiracy spawned by gay people being kidnapped from California, and then the Q-Force discovering that there is a war between the police force and the gay billionaires over using gay people for different things. The cops want to make non-union films, and the billionaires want to turn gay people juice into skincare.
The secret ingredient in all of Honestly's beauty products only be harvested from young, virile men.
Yeah, it's a little bit silly, but I do appreciate that they give themselves narratives that allow them to make comments on the way that police and capitalism interact with the queer community. Though they kind of do the same thing they did with the whole Kazaki thing, where they go for the super obvious option and then don't bother really expounding further upon the interesting ideas that they've set themselves up with. The billionaire thing barely gets dealt with before it ends, and the police thing 100% doesn't exist at all beyond the episode it's brought up in. Corporate pride gets a few jokes here and there, but isn't ever really treated as something worth considering, mostly because the show is way too busy moving on to the next arc of the AIA brainwashing its agents to forget things, especially going after minorities and making them forget they were spies or destroying their ability to actually work.
Not a memory. Something that's never happened. I've never been to Vienna.
This is it! This is what V needed me to find!
You might be thinking at that holy shit, that is so dark and such a horrifying narrative point, but if you watch the show, you might feel a bit of dissonance between the reality of what has been set up and how it ends up being resolved. The whole thing kinda just rolls quickly into them destroying the AIA supercomputer and stealing all the secrets so they can release them, only to have them stolen by the girl boss princess lady we mentioned from earlier, who attempts to mind control all the gays at her wedding, where she gets power because women in her fake European named country need to be married for them to receive the power to actually rule.
Princess is but a figurehead. It is only upon getting married that she becomes a husband-having queen.
And then she gets beaten, and rather than the AIA being dismantled, the Q-Force just gives themselves a pat on the back, and the director guy gets mind controlled for a little bit to give them a congratulations, and that's just sort of it.
Now this is my pride. I've never felt more proud in my life.
Q-Force so good.
It doesn't end on a cliffhanger, it doesn't really bother exploring the interesting stuff that it tries to get into, it just rushes through them, dumping random gay jokes and references on the way before having the gays beat the evil queer exploiting girl boss lady, and I suppose that's victory? I could keep bringing stuff up from the story, but all I would be doing here would be saying that it doesn't matter. Like how Stat's robot girlfriend that she gets from freeing an AI ends up killing herself to destroy the evil gay billionaire's machine, and Stat seems to be upset at this for all of like, I don't know, 2 seconds, before everyone just moves on to the next plot point, and it doesn't matter or have character ramifications at all. It doesn't even come up again after that point, they just kind of ignore it.
Lucky, I love funerals. Should I have had one for my dead girlfriend?
Maybe?
Steve is involved with a gay man dying because the cops target Steve and kill the other guy accidentally. Steve goes to his funeral. Steve hallucinates his corpse talking to him the whole episode. And then V throws a bunch of shitters about her old partner who supposedly died in the AIA brainwashing program called Grayscale, and Steve just sort of moves on from the whole trauma stuff, and it never gets mentioned again. Q-Force deals with a problem that I see a lot of shows who have short runtimes and short seasons deal with, where they try and cram all the cool things they want to do into the same space as a bigger show. And all it leads to is just creating these dramatic whiplash effects, where the audience is never allowed time to really learn characters, or see characters evolve, or have ramifications, because there just isn't the minutes available for it.
Leave, I'm about to kill my best friend.
Karen?
Not when we have to set up this cool scene that is planned, and also throw in this action moment, and who can forget letting Twink have half the goddamn fucking line so he can say some piffy little comment that gets the queer acting children excited. It's just a mess, is the best way to describe Q-Force. And that mess translates to the comedy too. There are funny moments, there are funny bits, and I know comedy is subjective and not everyone shares the same experience of it. But a flaw for Q-Force is the real lack of setup and delivery for comedy moments. A lot of them come across as random or seem to be relying upon us as the audience having more connection to these characters than we actually do. Like, certain things that get said by members of the Q-Force would hit a lot more if they were done seasons down the line when we were more attuned to the stylings of these characters. Kinda like how Archer has people who are funny when they do things because it's them doing the funny thing that they've become known for. Q-Force just kinda acts like that, but without the time spent getting us up to date on actually connecting with these characters. And that just feels like a show which knew it was never going to get another season. Much like how there is no cliffhanger ending so you can finish season 1 and truly feel that's it. It's all over. There's nothing else coming.
I'm Mary. Agent Mary.
And I suppose that mention of how the show feels as if it never expected to be renewed is as good a time as any to bring us to the final question to be answered here. What went wrong with Q-Force? Why did it not click with people or make it? And is there some grander takeaway that a content creator perhaps could possibly spin so that their audience steps away from the video feeling as if they learned something? I'm hoping there might be, otherwise I've really set myself up there for failure. Thanks script writing me if this isn't the case. Now, despite the insistence of the Google AI machine that the reason for Q-Force getting cancelled was so the fans would not be able to see a second season, a very funny fuck up from it that had me laughing for a minute or two over the idea of someone cancelling a show because you really don't want people to see what else could happen. Like, whatever was planned was too much for the audience to handle, so you just had to pull the plug on the whole thing. Or alternatively, it being some kind of bitter response by Netflix. They were so mad at the Q-Force fans and were like, no, you don't deserve a second season. We're cancelling it so you don't get one. Fuck you, queer people. I'm not that worried about the AI stealing my job anytime soon, because this obviously isn't the reason at all. The fact of the matter is that we don't know the explicit reason for Q-Force being cancelled after one season, though there are plentiful logical justifications that you could point to. Firstly, you could say how the entire show had a very tumultuous production cycle due to it being done in the pandemic. The entire process of making the pretty short season taking 18 months, and being a grueling challenge for the team, what with the whole lockdown and isolation requirements, causing this to be a longer process than necessary, and potentially a lot more expensive one too. Something that the Netflix algorithmic machine maybe doesn't account for when it decides who gets put on the chopping block and tells the peripheral humans working there to cancel stuff. I mean, I assume that Netflix is run by an AI as smart as the Google one, and involving people who don't bother questioning the logic of that AI, because sometimes the shows that are axed or continued come across as quite esoteric choices that presumably align with some metric that we the audience don't necessarily get or understand. But Q-Force had a lot of other problems too. There was obviously the initial trailer and promo that got released by Netflix, which presented the show with all the flaws that I have mentioned so far from watching it at the forefront, and being exampled as like the only thing that the show did.
I wasted all that masculinity on nothing.
Not nothing. My little butthole went boop.
Interesting choice to say the least, that felt as if it was doing its best to tank the show before it even came out. I mean, you could consider that as a case of Netflix just not understanding what Q-Force was trying to do at all and having a different perception of what fans would want from it, but people involved in the writing staff and the creative staff seemed to somewhat agree with the assessment that Q-Force was meant to be a basic show that didn't really explore too deeply anything that it brought up, and was merely entertainment for a few hours with a queer face splattered on it. But that whole promotion led to Q-Force getting the treatment of queer people kinda just being critical of what they saw in the trailer and questioning if this was even going to be a show that wasn't just corporate pandering, alongside having a bunch of right-wing outlets and personalities make a huge deal over the disintegration of morals and ethics and just all the culture war bullshit that has become massively exhausting and so repeated at this point by these goddamn culture tourists that it feels like it doesn't even fucking matter anymore. When every single game, show and movie that comes out gets the same treatment by these people who have to put it into either a woke bullshit that's going to fail or anti-woke masterpiece the left don't want to succeed category, you really start to question if those people are doing it because they actually think that, or if that's just what makes them money and they need to keep doing whatever gets them clicks. However, beyond that initial trailer-based reaction, Q-Force did, when it got released, get universally panned by critics. Even those that had kind things to say acknowledged many of the issues that I mentioned here, and it did become pretty apparent that this wasn't a good show. That it was filled with flaws and characterization/writing that had not connected that well with critics or audiences. Even if you are a fan of Q-Force, and I think I can see reasons why some people might be, I can certainly believe that there are certain people for whom its style and the what it does would be funny and would be engaging. Even with that fact, I think it's important to acknowledge the problems and the fact that in a more universal sense, Q-Force was not a high-quality, well-put-together experience.
We have to answer the call of duty, Buck.
Answered the call of duty 15 minutes ago. I'm duty-free, sister.
But, despite all those facts, none of this means that Q-Force should have failed. Many people love to cling to that idea that success in the capitalist world we live in is equated to being good, and failure occurs to those things that are bad. But that's just the meritocratic dream that we like to cling to because it means that we get to ignore the reality wherein many bad shows go on for ages and many good shows get cancelled despite their artistic measures.
I do the job, and then I get paid.
Just because Q-Force was bad by the metrics that I'm using does not mean it deserved to only have one season. I mean, I love plenty of terrible shows that went on for so long. Looking at you, Once Upon a Time in Supernatural. No, what I want to say here is actually something that kept coming back to me when I thought about Q-Force and failure, and the real queer disaster at the heart of all of this. And that's that we queer people deserve to have shit TV plastered with our faces too. I understand that as a community we just don't have that much representation, and we especially don't have that much queer-led representation, and so that lack of it, I think, pushes the community to be more critical and to be more demanding of everything involving us being the best it could be, and if it isn't that, then it's the worst thing ever. However, straight people get so many shows featuring them and having them at their centre that they don't even have to care about that fact. They can have shit shows galore, terrible, appalling shows in almost every goddamn genre to cater to their wants and needs. I mean, God, talk about an example of the dominance of straight cis identity. I can't think of a more clear example than how often we are left scrabbling over scraps while the straights get a whole banquet of experience to connect to and consume.
What are you doing?
Making sure he stays occupied.
But that's the point. For us to really have that equality, for us to really get that normalization, and that same standing as straight cis people, queer people need to have TV shows that are just not that good, but still keep going, where queer characters are at the forefront and are not immediately blamed or pointed to as the reason for why the show is bad. We deserve to have our gay Family Guy, our gay How I Met Your Mother, our gay Once Upon a Time, our gay Supernatural, and don't say that gay people exist in those shows because you and I both know how little that fucking means. We both know how barely there queer people are, and how the treatment of our community in those shows is so often being pushed to the outsides or given special little episodes going over our special little experiences in the most patronising way imaginable. When I say gay, you say how high. No, wait. That's not right. When I say gay, I mean a cast comprised of queer people who don't necessarily have to have their queerness as all they are, but constantly reference their queerness in the same way that straight people reference their straightness, or cis people engage with their gender identity. Which is sort of exactly what Q-Force did. It did have all the queer stuff, except for trans people, just kinda crammed in every possible place to the same degree that we see cis straightness crammed into these other shows. And the fact that it doing that was such a stark thing to see really speaks to how rare such an occurrence is.
Sorry if this is weird. I was in the neighborhood and I had this great bottle of wine and I was just wondering, you want to watch a movie or something?
So, yeah. Its failure was, as my title puts it, a disaster. But it was a disaster, not just because of how the show was put together and performed, but also because it was a queer dominant show that didn't manage to persevere through being bad to keep going. And I worry that the wrong lessons will be learned by TV executives and the computers that advise them. That the message will be that explicitly queer run shows fail because they are queer. The final conclusion here is that we deserve shit shows too. We deserve shows that make non-fans look at them and go, Jesus fucking Christ, how the hell did this thing get 8 seasons? Who enjoys this crap? Because that's equality right there. Anyway, if you enjoyed what I said, or agreed with the words I was saying, or just found me to be acceptable background noise while you played Baldur's Gate 3 or COD Black Ops 6, I see you, Kim. I know what you're doing. God, I hope someone called Kim is playing those games and watching right now, because that's got to be a fucking fright for them, eh? But yeah, if you did like this and want to help keep this channel running, the best way to do that is by going to my Patreon or my Ko-Fi in the links below and subscribing there. The names of those in the $5 and up category should be scrolling past the screen right now. And I'm hugely grateful to everyone who is a patron of this show. It not only gives me the financial security of paying my rent, power, food, internet, and cat to allow me to focus on making the videos that I want to make and personally find interesting to create, it also motivates me to keep making videos by showing that there are people out there who are so invested in what I am doing that they're willing to pay to keep having me do it. That's a massively important thing for a lot of creators, I believe, to have. That really shows how much what you are creating matters to people more than just yourself. And ultimately, that is something that I care about too. I want people to see what I make. I want people to experience my thoughts on shows or games, because otherwise I wouldn't post them online. But yeah, I have nothing but the highest regard for all my patrons for what they're doing for this channel. And if you are able to give there, it really does go a long way. Otherwise, you can like, share, subscribe, comment, click on other videos, all the usual YouTube stuff that helps in a more algorithmic sense, or at least we all seem to believe it does. No real proof of that, but it's nice to have faith that the system is working in some functional way and not, just a nightmarish, impossible, esoteric mess. With all of that said though, thank you for watching this video, and I hope you have a great, queer day.